All right.
Yes, here I am.
So,
Sorry.
Whose brainchild was this? And tell me a little bit about what it was like to put together this documentary.
So I have always cared a lot about voting. Everybody on this call cares a lot about voting. And in 2016, well, I first started thinking about it in real terms when Shelby County versus Holder came down. And I'll tell just one personal story. My wife's family, her dad was a civil rights lawyer. She's from Mississippi. And when that opinion came down, and John Roberts is a contemporary of mine at college and at law school, and I hadn't read a Supreme Court opinion in many years, and I read that one. And I said, gosh, this doesn't seem authentic to me. This seems very dangerous. I called some of my wife's relatives down in Mississippi. They call themselves poverty lawyers. And I said, have you read this opinion? And they said, yeah, we have. And it was a little bit of a surprise, but very welcome news indeed to learn from the Chief Justice in Washington, D.C., that the era of racial discrimination in voting in the American South is over. Very welcome news indeed. So I started watching it a little bit more closely at that time. I then saw all these voter suppression laws start to be passed. But it wasn't until 2016 when this narrative of voter fraud was starting to get out of hand that I resolved to become active. And I resolved to write a book. Academic mindset, take a year or two to research it and write it, only to find out that several really excellent books had just been written. But no one was telling the micro stories. No one was making it come alive on film. I knew nothing about documentary film, but was lucky enough through a friend of a friend of a friend to meet Tim. And then together, Tim and I built a team of journalists, documentarians, researchers. And there we are in the summer of 2016. You're going to make this film. Where do you go? Where is this happening? And to make a long story short, we obviously went to North Carolina, Texas, Missouri, and Wisconsin. We tried very hard to find the right story in Ohio. And that's when the Philip Randolph Institute lawsuit on the purge was happening. But it didn't make the final cut. We filmed a lot in Georgia. There are a number of stories on the cutting room floor from Georgia. And we found suppressed voters all over the country. What we didn't expect was to get access to Jay Delancey and Mike Hires in North Carolina, to Catherine Engelbrecht, who appears only briefly in Texas, to Sheriff Pam in Texas, et cetera, and so on. And obviously listening to that side is very important for all of us. And Tim and I and others spent a lot of time in the months after the election. Of course, the president then extended the story with the Voter Fraud Commission, if you remember that, and these allegations, and then the court packing that's gone on since then. But Tim and I and others spent many weeks and months in rooms with the Post-it notes up on the wall about how do you make this into a film. But the essential spine of the narrative, which is that, which you saw, Obama's election caused a backlash, caused the Republican Party to rethink how they were going to approach voters. They had a choice, either choice A, let's make the tent bigger, or choice B, let's not. And they chose choice B, and we draw a pretty straight line from that point to the present day. What I'm disappointed to report is that we might have cut off filming too early, because the votes that have, the laws that have been passed since we finished major filming, the lawsuits that have been brought, yes, the key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been struck down, but there's a very thoughtfully constructed effort to eliminate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which will essentially take the law off the books. And if you had told me 10 years ago that American citizens would be suing to get rid of the Voting Rights Act altogether, I would have told you Strom Thurmond was a thing of the past. even Strom Thurmond voted to renew the Voting Rights Act in 2006 or 2008. So the idea that we've regressed from there is shocking to me, and should be shocking to all Americans of good faith. And at this point, obviously, with some of the things the president has said about voter fraud, the shame is out of it. And so we are in a last-ditch effort of some urgency to save our democracy. So that has kept Tim and me and our colleagues like Christina and all of you going, and will keep us going, because we will fight to keep our democracy.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to throw this out to Jen Miller. So most of us are aware that Project Red Map played a really important role in changing the Democratic House to a Republican House. We have a sense of the role of dark money. I just would like to ask you, Jen, to tell us a little bit about what happened with Red Map, what happened with the gerrymandering here in Ohio. And, you know, as we listened to this story and we thought about other states, can you tell us a little bit about what happened here in Ohio?
I think that's great. And first, I did see some note about, you know, parties playing roles in this. And I just want to say something like gerrymandering happens from both parties, right? And the League of Women Voters was fighting gerrymandering when Democrats had the pen too. And so I want to make that clear, that we have to make sure we have nonpartisan groups in the mix, because nonpartisan groups really are working to make sure all voters are represented. And that's just so critical. But bottom line is there was a concerted effort to manipulate our maps for the last 10 years. And one thing I just want to mention is that gerrymandering builds upon gerrymandering builds upon gerrymandering. So we've had gerrymandered maps that then allow for enough of a majority to make worse gerrymandered maps, right? And that continues to happen. So the concept of Project Red Map was very alive and well here in Ohio. The Republicans at the national RNC and especially Boehner's staff were working directly with lawmakers and consultants for the Ohio Republican Party, and they were really rigging the system to guarantee that both the Ohio State House maps and the congressional maps would result in large Republican wins, regardless of voter turnout, regardless of voter, even changes in voter opinions, right? That they were, and the main reason why I see this as a problem, and I see this actually as a problem for all voters, right? Because if you're a Republican, and even if you have a Republican representing you, that Republican representing you doesn't really have to listen to you, right? They can just kind of do what they want. They have impunity. The same, quite frankly, with the Democrat. Who is and you are being represented by a Democrat, they don't necessarily have to listen to the grassroots. Both sets can really just listen to their parties and their big donors. But then, of course, it's a much larger issue when we talk about the fact that, of course, communities of color, low-income communities were divided. Here in Central Ohio, where I'm at, they had something called the Franklin County sinkhole, where they called it dog meat territory, literally in emails that we got through the ACLU and APRI and the league's work, dog meat territory. So let's get some of this dog meat voting territory out of this one area, so we can guarantee, you know, how we do these 3 congressional districts, we can guarantee it will always be 2 Republican and 1 Democrat. That's the kind of thing that hurts my heart, because no voter should ever be called dog meat, right? And the idea that the audacity to use math and to use like this bunker in a hotel room, which is where they created these maps, and then the league and Common Cause and all of our friends, NAACP, ACLU, we're then not even realizing what's happening, because, you know, the media, no one was allowed in that bunker when these maps were being made to manipulate the process. So I'll stop, Catherine, because, you know, I could go on for hours about how ugly this is. But the bottom line is this: grassroots power is diminished when our maps are gerrymandered. And so it doesn't matter what issue is important to you. grassroots power is diminished, and that is the problem that we see in Ohio. And we now have an opportunity to upend that with ballot initiatives. And so first, make sure you participate in your census, and then make sure you're hanging out with us all of next year as we work on trying to hold this legislature accountable.
So one of the questions that we were asked had to do with, well, how is 2021 going to be different? And I'm going to throw that to Mia Lewis. And the 2021 different when it comes to map making.
In Ohio, 2021 will be different in Ohio than it was in 2011. So we'll be drawing new state legislative maps and US congressional maps, but we'll be using new rules because in 2015, we passed a ballot initiative that changed the way that Ohio state districts are created. And in 2018, we passed a ballot initiative that changed the way the congressional maps are drawn. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to have better guardrails in place to make sure that there can be fewer splits in counties, that communities have to be kept together, that there's kind of fair political representation in the sense that you can't have, a federal vote go 50-50, and then suddenly you have the districts are divided 75-25 as they are now. So, but we need to still keep our eye on the ball because the state and the congressional rules are slightly different. One is the redistricting commission, and the other is an attempt to make a bipartisan map in the legislature, and if that doesn't work, then it goes to step B, and then step C, and then step D. But the bottom line is that we have to pressure our legislators to let them know that we need and require them to have fair, bipartisan, nonpartisan maps, that they engage with each other to make maps that represent communities where the voters choose their politicians and not the other way around. And we will send you in our email, our follow-up email, we'll send you a link for you guys to take a pledge to support fair maps in Ohio, and also for you to encourage your legislators to sign a pledge that they will work to create fair maps in Ohio.
Thanks, Mia. So Camille, one of the things I noticed in the film was a billboard that we would have seen a few years ago if we were traveling, in the Cleveland area, if we were near Touchdown Jesus in Cincinnati. Can you tell us a little bit about why that billboard is voter suppression and what you thought of the film?
Sure. So I remember those billboards. Those were pretty hideous. They were up in predominantly African-American neighborhoods in Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus, telling folks that voter fraud was a crime and it was going to, punishable by a felony. And of course, the message there was to make folks who have criminal backgrounds leery of participating in the political process. We already know that there is a lot of sort of misinformation and undereducation about folks in Ohio's ability to participate in the process once they have come off paper. And so, we really try to work, I know our friends at the ACLU and others really try to impress upon people that in Ohio, we have some good laws in terms of as long as you're not currently incarcerated for a felony, people who are on probation or parole, or if they have a misdemeanor, those folks can continue to participate. We even have, All Voting is Local has been leading up these campaigns to register people who are voting in jail. And so we just have a lot of work to do in terms of getting people educated, and so they're not fearful of the process, so they can be reintegrated back in society and include that full right to participation.
All right, now I have a follow-up, and this can be answered by basically anyone. We are in the midst of a primary that was established by this, basically this extension was established by the state legislature. And there are definite obstacles to vote by mail what are the kinds of recommendations you all would make to make this so that voters are able to actually cast a ballot in November? So as we're thinking about the coronavirus, what are the kinds of things that the State House should be considering so that we're not in the same kind of boat as we're in right now?
Is this for me, Catherine?
It can be for you. Why don't we have it start out with you, and then, but I'd love to hear, from others. So let's go to you, and then Jen, maybe. It looks like Jen's interested.
Yeah. So one of the things that I would really like to see is for us to have some strong contingency planning in the event that it is not safe for folks to be able to vote in person. And that means trying to really abbreviate this vote by mail system. So instead of having it be a two-step process where voters have to request a ballot and then wait and then get the actual ballot, if we could just go ahead and send voters ballots in November, I think that would be a really helpful step to getting people to participate, because we know people have issues with getting access to printers. I know I don't have a printer here in my house. Some folks don't have postage. And so just being able to easily have folks vote from home would be a super helpful thing. And that's one of the things that we really started pushing last week. We have a letter that we sent to the legislators asking them to really strongly consider sending all registered voters a absentee ballot for November.
Yeah, so, and I really love to hear from Collin and Brandi too, but let me just say this. Number one, what we have here going on right now is not really vote by mail, okay? The way vote by mail works in other states, in all vote by mail states, there's still in-person voting options. There's no application process. There's much longer time frame. And so that's one thing. I hear a lot of people saying that they think we should just make vote by mail standard. Here's, I think, what we as the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition are saying that's slightly different. We're saying, let's assume that we have to vote by mail for the August special and the November general. And let's get every voter a ballot, because we have to just assume that the coronavirus is going to be here. Let's not shut down voting locations right now. Let's do our best to keep them open, because let us understand this, there are lots of populations that do not want to vote by mail, right? And may not be well served by mail. Individuals who are homeless, individuals who have disabilities, communities of color, low-income individuals. There are so many groups that are not well served for vote by mail. So the way real vote by mail would work would be everyone gets the ballot. There's at least 8 to 10 weeks to turn this around. There's none of this janky application process. And there's still the ability to show up to vote centers all over the counties. So we are saying, let us be ready for more of a vote by mail process. But in the long term, the Voting Rights Coalition is not saying that vote by mail should be standard. We're saying that there's ways to make our absentee process more effective, and that we need to put in place contingency plans so that if we have to change election logistics, it can be done in a reasonable, transparent, and fair way. Because let's admit that we are unfortunately in the world of superbugs and climate change. We're gonna have more problems with our elections, and I hate it, but we will. And so please, we would love to have you get involved with us with all of these activities. But I saw Brandi especially nodding, and so I would love to give her some space here.
No, thanks, Jen. I think Camille and Jennifer, you guys are dead on. There are too many people in minority communities that enjoy going to the polls. And so it can't just be a by mail only. It has to be equipping boards of elections with everything they need to sanitize, social distance. You know, we're preparing for the long term, but at the same time, preparing for what I think is inevitable, another resurgence of COVID, but making sure every county has the same access to resources to make it safe. Because absolutely, there is a distrust in communities that if I send it in by mail, it's not going to be counted. Who's going to get it? Where is it going to go? So, I was nodding, Jennifer and both Camille, in full agreement with what you're saying, both saying. And just glad, Jennifer, that you made clear that our position as a coalition is both voting from home as well as voting in person.
Can I
Well,
add?
thank you both. Oh, look like, do you have something you wanted to add, Mia?
Very, very briefly, yeah, and I 100% agree, and there are lots of very simple ways that we can make these things work better. For example, so right now, the disabled and the homeless will be able to vote at the BOE on quote election day next Tuesday. But why is there only one vote center per county? There's one vote center in Franklin County, and there's one vote center in Noble County. That clearly doesn't make any sense. So, you know, another thing that we have recommended, for example, this is just to give an example of ways that we can improve the process, is why don't we have multiple vote centers per county, or allow counties to have multiple vote centers? And that way, if we are in the middle of some kind of crisis, we can have election day voting at multiple locations. It wouldn't have to be just at one location. So there are a lot of things that we can do short of just switching 100% to vote by mail, and even improving the vote by mail process. A lot of people are disenfranchised because of signature match, for example, and we can sort that out. So.
All right, so I have a question for Collin. So I think that most of us watched what happened in Wisconsin with horror. And we were very concerned about what's going on with the U.S. Supreme Court, what's going on with the federal courts. And this also goes back to the Rucho v. Common Cause, where they were like, oh, we're sorry, federal courts have no role in addressing gerrymandering. Could you tell us a little bit about what the ACLU is up to, what you're thinking about, all of the challenges that we're facing now with the courts?
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. So to start off, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided in the North Carolina, Wisconsin cases, it was that they ruled that the issue of partisan gerrymandering was non-justiciable, if I pronounced that word correctly, meaning it was a political question. The justices didn't feel confident intervening in a process and in a problem that is inherently political. So they essentially just punted on that. However, that still reverts a legal avenue at the state level for groups to challenge these unconstitutional gerrymandered maps. There are protections in the state constitutions. I know in Pennsylvania, the reason they were able to have success is they have a clause in their constitution that guarantees their voters access to a free and fair election. So that is a specific piece of language within their constitution that allows them to go in front of their state Supreme Court and challenge. So at the ACLU, you know, we are always looking to, you know, go in front of our Supreme Court justices at the Supreme Court, and we have done that repeatedly. But it looks as if, you know, you're not going to be able to get any relief from the federal court system. So reverting back to the state level is going to be the most plausible avenue for relief in these situations going forward. So, and that only makes, you know, this election cycle even more critical with a couple of Ohio Supreme Court judicial races on the ballot as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but right now it seems as though all action is shifting back down to the state level. So.
And now I have a question for Brandi. I actually am always really moved when I hear Reverend Barber talk about, you know, Christianity and love and justice. And I was really wondering, you know, what the Ohio Council of Churches is up to this year and what you're thinking about voting rights.
So I believe that voting is an extension of faith, just very clearly. And there are so many issues that are impacted by voting, by just civic participation. You know, census counts dictate funding that comes in our communities. Voting is who we elect to represent our interests. So as a body of faith, We have to be actively engaged in voting and encouraging our parishioners to also vote, because it is an extension of the society that we live in, and making a society be more fair, more just. I think looking at the film, and I'm just excited that it was dedicated to both Congressman Cummings and the other young lady, I draw a blank on her name, but what she said was fed up and fired up. And I think in our communities, that's a unique place that the faith community can play, is helping to inspire people to not be so overwhelmed by all of the distractions, laser in and making sure that they are doing what they need to do to make their voice heard. So for me, it is, it's, you know, I would, oftentimes when you talk to people of faith, folks are looking for us to give maybe a scriptural basis or some theological foundation. But I just think part of being a human, part of living in America, part of living in Ohio, Franklin County, Columbus, wherever, means that you have to participate in the systems that are around you. And then you have to speak truth to power when those systems fail the people that are important to us. So you can't neglect voting and participation for those reasons.
All right, I have one final question, and then we're going to, which I realize we have not gotten to everything that people have. So President Trump the other day said that vote by mail was rife with fraud. And the fraud is often used to keep people out. And I wondered what you all made, and anybody can answer this, you know, what you all made of that argument that it was rife with fraud.
I guess I'll go first. I'll just say this, like, fraud in general is non-existent, right? This is not a problem that we really have in Ohio. It is exceedingly rare. That's going to be the case in vote by mail too. We hear this sometimes about if we send ballots to everyone, but the bottom line is individuals still have to prove who they are through that ballot process. They have to sign, they have to provide various information. And so it would be very difficult for vote by mail to create a fraud situation. And I think we need to be very careful, because fraud becomes an excuse for actually making voting far more difficult. And we know that when voting gets more difficult, people of color, young people, students, people with disabilities, low-income individuals, new Americans are going to have a harder time generally. And so I think we need to just push back on any concept of fraud and understand that that's code for trying to suppress voters.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I just my real quick response is that it's total crap, and that's the bottom line. I mean, you know, Jen, you said it eloquently. You know, I come from a background where I have advocated for Medicaid and an expansion of Medicaid, and the argument you hear when you run in certain offices is fraud, when statistically you know what the numbers say. Like, it's almost non-existent. So it's just total BS, and that's what I have to say about it.
Mac, it looked like you had something to say. Oh, go off mute.
Well, can I just pop in? Oh, no, there you go.
Sure, please.
No, go ahead.
I have the same thing to say. I'm embarrassed to report how much time Tim and I and others have spent over the last several years actually standing there and saying, you know what? We're in a position, somebody ought to chase this stuff down and see if there's anything to it. Because if there really is fraud, I want to know. Fraud would be a terrible thing in our elections. And so you saw the part with Chris Kobach where he says voter fraud is a significant issue in Kansas. And our guy, Sam Pollard, says he only found 9 cases. And this is in multiple years. And he's got a excuse there. voting by mail, there is no evidence that it produces an extraordinary amount of fraud. I can cite multiple instances where fraud was attempted in vote by mail and caught. For the same reasons that Jen says, there are many safeguards about how does the ballot go out, what procedures take place after it went in. This is not vote by mail in 1950. There are systems that we've learned through the banking system and through many other systems that make vote by mail really safe. And many people of good faith, including our president, routinely vote by mail.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is without evidence, and I will share that I believe it to be incorrect to say that vote by mail is rife with fraud or an invitation to fraud. There's no evidence that that is true. By the way, I'll offer also that there's really no evidence that vote by mail helps one party more than the other party. To me, what it does is expand the set of people who can vote. Many of us like to vote in person. We think it's a really cool, voting day and election day. Everybody in the country speaks with the same voice. I think that's beautiful, but vote by mail is fine too. And so I think it's important to keep our feet on the ground, listen to what people say, and when they allege fraud, and take the time to see if it's really true. I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years. It's not. Mia?
So I have to say, I was really taken by the poll, and that the number one, thing that we were concerned about was gerrymandering, and the second had to do with money in politics. And I think as we think about what we just went through in Ohio with House Bill 6 and the dark money surrounding that, I think, we will need to have an additional conversation later to talk about the role of money in politics and how it's all interconnected to the other problems that we have with our democracy, including judges hearing the cases of their campaign contributors. We also need to have a conversation about direct democracy and how to make that function better. We do know that the ballot board recently engaged in, shall we say, some shenanigans. And so as we think about moving forward and on democracy issues, and we have moved forward on democracy issues using the power of signature gathering. We've stopped bad voter suppression bills. We've actually moved reforms like redistricting reform. And so we do need to think about direct democracy and addressing that as well. Now, does anybody have any final words that they'd like to add? Because I think we're coming close to the time to end. Mac,
you're on mute.
Jen, did you say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, okay, let's make sure that if you have not asked for your ballot yet, that you make sure to request your ballot immediately. If you can go on the voteohio.gov, you can print that off, or you could actually write your own information on a piece of paper. That needs to be postmarked by April 27th. We keep hearing election day is the 28th, but if you put it in the mail on the 28th, it's not going to count. If you have problems or concerns with voting, all of us are here to help you. Probably the easiest thing to remember is to call 866-OUR-VOTE, and all of these organizations will be reading those tickets and be doing everything we can to help you this primary. And just know that we are already planning and we are already advocating to make elections from the future better. So stay tuned with us. Go ahead.
And you can also advocate for making those elections better. And we are going to be sending you in a follow-up email a link to write to your legislators and ask them to act now. Now is really the time that they need to act in order to make sure that we can secure the November elections and that we don't have the kind of mess that we had this time, and that everyone is able to participate. But we really, really need everybody to write to their legislators, and we will send you a link to do that. And we would appreciate it if you not only did it yourself, but if you try to share that around your circles to get as many people as possible to get the our Ohio lawmakers to improve the election in November.
Well, thank you all. I can't tell you how much I appreciate us being able to watch a film together and participate in polls. Do you notice our favorite thing to do is to vote?
Yay.
On that note, I just, wanted to say thank you just in case. Does anybody have anything else they want to add? Yes, Mac.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for showing our film to this great group of people. Our film, could other organizations on this call, be they chapters of the League of Women Voters, churches within Brandi's coalition, we make this film available for free. We would like to hand it to you. We would love to participate in these Q&A panels. Our mission is to educate and motivate, and we feel urgency in helping that happen. So on our website, which is riggedthefilm.com, there is a button entitled Request a Showing, and you can go to that, or you can get to us through Mia or Catherine or any of the people on the panel. Just email one of us and we'll get it going. Thank you very much.
Thank you all and good night. We appreciate it. Thank you again to Christina. Thanks to Mac. Thanks to Tim. Thank you, Jen, Collin,
Catherine.
everybody. Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening. Be well.